Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to week 4. This week we're going to talk about fragments and run-on sentences. Of course, last week we talked about commas. The week before that we talked about the writing process. And the week before that we talked about the 8 parts of speech. All those things will kind of go together as we explore fragments and run-on sentences throughout this week's thing. Obviously, we talked about independent and dependent clauses a little bit in our video. We'll talk about those more as we go along. These things are all going to be important to understand as we move forward. If you're still kind of unsure on some of those concepts, or you don't feel quite right, maybe you want to go back and look at some of those videos, or maybe you want to go back and revisit some of those exercises or some of those other lectures, and to get a good idea of where we go, so we can go ahead and move forward and you can really learn what you need to learn in this class. But like I said, this week we're talking about fragments and run-on sentences, so let's go ahead and get started. All right, so some of the most common errors in student writing involve sentence fragments and run-on sentences. You've probably, throughout maybe high school, or maybe if you've taken another writing class, someone has probably said somewhere down the line, hey, you have a real problem with sentence fragments, or you have a problem with run-on sentences. A lot of people understand that about their writing, but they don't really understand what it takes to fix that, or even really necessarily what the concept means. They just know that they've been told that they've done these things wrong. So here we're going to look at these concepts, and we're going to hopefully shed a little light, demystify, if you will, what these parts mean. So to understand these concepts, let's look back at the basic structure of a sentence. All right? All sentences, if you remember, all sentences do something, right? We always have a subject, and we always have a verb. They're always doing something, right? Sometimes we'll have a direct object, sometimes we'll have all these other things. But mainly, like, it's always doing something. So remember, once again, the English language is active, and for a sentence to be complete, it has to have at least 2 parts, right? We just talked about this 3 seconds ago, but once again, just to reiterate, it has to have a verb or an action word, and it has to have a subject, which is a noun or a pronoun performing that action. That's the basic structure of a sentence. So we need to really understand that as we to really get the concepts of fragments and run-on sentences. So let's look a little more about that concept before we move forward, right? In our example here, we have dogs are better than cats. Remember, in this sentence, the verb is are. What are, and then the subject is dogs, right? So which animals in this sentence, which animals does this sentence claim are better than cats, right? Which animals are? Well, dogs are in this sense. You may not agree with this sentence. However, that's the claim that's being made. Dogs are, dogs being the subject, are being the verb, dogs are, and then what are dogs? Well, they're better than cats. See how that works. It's a relatively simple sentence, but we have to understand those concepts. So moving on. A sentence fragment, we're going to start with that. A sentence fragment leaves out either the verb or a subject. Or in many cases, we're going to go back to that subordinate conjunction that we talked about earlier, right? So in many cases, it's going to begin with a subordinate conjunction. Right? So let's look at some examples. Martha is completely mad, period, really crazy. Right? So in this, we're having a problem, because even though Martha is completely mad, what is Martha? Martha being our subject. Martha is being the verb. So Martha is, what is Martha? Martha is completely mad. But the second part, the second thing, is what we're going to find our problem, right? This is the problematic thing, because it's missing both the subject and the verb, right? Because the subject and the verb are actually in the sentence before that, right? We're saying that Martha is also really crazy, but we've got it in a totally different section, right? We've got it as its own sentence, so it doesn't make sense, right? So how would we fix that? We'll talk about that as we move on. Second thing, let's look at just another concept, right? Because reindeer only come around once a year. Right? We have a subject, reindeer, right? What do reindeer do? Well, they come around, right? Actually, come would be the thing, but reindeer come around, and then once a year, of course, being when they come around, right? So although this sentence has a verb, right, and a subject, it's got both of those, it starts with that word because, and that word because is being a little bit problematic because that's going to be our subordinate conjunction. So this is why we really need to understand the whole idea of what a subordinate conjunction does. This is a really important part. So if you don't have that concept down yet, go back to that list in the book and look at basically how that works and how that's formed, and that'll help you with understanding what a subordinate and I actually say subordinating, and here's technically a subordinate conjunction. So make sure that you're getting that correct. This sentence does represent a thought, but it's an incomplete or fragmented thought, simply because of that first word in our group. So let's move on and let's talk about how to fix some of these things. All right. So we have to remember that a complete sentence has to perform an action, and it has to have something or someone perform that action. These things have to happen. If we don't have that happening, right, then we don't actually have a complete sentence, and therefore it's fragmented, right? If the sentence is missing either a subject or verb, like we just said, it's fragmented. It's not a full and complete sentence. If a clause, or the first part of the sentence, right, if it starts with a subordinating conjunction, and here's a nice list: after, although, because, before, even though, if, since, than, that, though, unless, until, when, where, whether, or while, right? If it's any of those words, right, it's a subordinate clause, also known as a dependent clause, right? And it needs to be paired with another clause to be complete. It needs to be prepared with an independent clause. An independent clause, once again, is a part of the sentence that could stand on its own. It could be a complete sentence on its own. And while this may sound confusing, and in many ways it is, these are the kind of things that hopefully you're beginning to understand, and they're beginning kind of turn in your brain, and you're really starting to understand the way language works. So let's move on and talk about some of this other stuff. All right. So there are some exceptions to the rule, and we need to understand that there's exceptions. But these are very uncommon, right? So, but if either the subject or verb is missing, but it's implied, the sentence is complete. All right, that sounds kind of weird, because you can say, well, I implied that. That's not a really good excuse, though. But look at how this works, right? For instance, we have this sentence: go away, right? We have a verb, right? We have go. We have the word away, which is actually a preposition, right? But we don't have a subject. We're not saying who should go away. But because we're saying this to someone, we're implying the word you, right? Y-O-U, right? We're implying that word, which would actually be our subject. So in this, we actually have that going. So if it's missing a subject, but it's directed toward the reader, the word you is implied, as we say here. So it would actually read, you go away, right? But we don't really say the you in our writing, or especially not in our speech. We just direct it toward that person, right? Go away. And of course the same can be said for a missing verb, but neither of these structures is typically accepted in academic writing. You may use it when you're doing a narrative style, which we'll explain a little further when we talk about rhetorical modes later on in the class. But neither of these structures, but you should really avoid these in other modes of writing. You should kind of get away from those, unless it's dialogue, which is going to exist in narrative writing. So while this is a rule and an exception to the rule, for the most part, don't really think about this. Don't really worry about it. Use your instincts as far as when to use it, when to not, and hopefully that'll serve you well. So let's move on. Let's move a little bit forward here. Okay. So now let's talk about run-on sentences. Let's move on and talk about the other piece of the puzzle that we're kind of exploring this week. Right? Run-on sentences is actually the opposite of a sentence fragment, but it's just as common. In fact, it may be even more common. In fact, most of my students that I deal with know that they have a problem with run-on sentences. In fact, it's one of the first things they identify when they're talking about problems that they've had with writing. They say, I have a problem with run-on sentences. They know that, but they don't really know what a run-on sentence is. So hopefully, let's start talking about that. So, run-on sentences occur when we join independent clauses without correct punctuation, right? So we join pieces of sentences that could be sentences on their own, but we don't use that coordinating conjunction, and we don't use when we don't use any real punctuation between. There's different ways, of course, that we can fix run-on sentences. We'll talk about that a little bit later as we go on with this video. So yeah, when we're joining independent clauses without the correct punctuation, or and then really kind of understanding as we go through this, run-on sentences actually come in two different forms, and you may have heard these things about your sentences as well, and maybe you haven't made the connection, right? But the two forms are what we call fused sentences, right, which is essentially joining the sentences together without the right punctuation, or comma splices, where we simply use a comma but we forget the coordinating conjunction and we put those together, and those are going to be what we call comma splices. Let's talk about those independently, and we'll kind of work our way through this. Right? So a fused sentence occurs when one or more independent clauses are joined without punctuation between them. Right? So we've talked a little bit about that. We've talked about that in the sense of it being a run-on sentence, but this is really the fused sentence part of that construction, right? So here's our example. I stayed up all night working, the morning sun was beautiful. I stayed up all night working, the morning sun was beautiful. Notice how we have two different ideas, two different sentences kind of blended together, right? We have I stayed up all night working, right? That's great. And then we have the second part, the morning sun was beautiful, right? They're two different ideas. They may be linked together because when you stayed up all night working, you noticed at the end of that the morning sun was beautiful, right? But they're not actually the same idea. They could stand on their own. They could be independent from each other. They could be independent sentences. So there are a couple of, well, actually several ways to fix this, and let's talk about those. All right, so here are the ways. We could either use a comma and a subordinating conjunction. Once again, we're going back to that, so a really important concept to remember. Use a comma and subordinating conjunction to fix this. So we could say, although I stayed up all night working, the morning sun was beautiful. Right? So though I was tired, though I stayed up all night, and I was exhausted because I had so much work to do and I had to stay up all night working, but the payoff was that in the morning the sun was beautiful. I don't normally get to experience that because I never up that early, or whatever the case may be for the sentence. But although I stayed up all night working, the morning sun was beautiful. Right? Notice where the comma is. Notice that we put that subordinating conjunction in the beginning, and how fantastic that is. Okay, so that actually works, and that's going to get rid of that whole idea of those fused sentences. Another way to do that is to just put a period in it. Just make them two separate sentences. Right? So I stayed up all night working. The morning sun was beautiful. Right? Those are ideas that maybe relate to each other. They look great following each other in a sentence. However, they could be on their own, so let's go ahead and leave them on their own. We can just drop a period in there and everything's fine. The next one is we can separate the sentence with a semicolon. Right? A semicolon is basically a form of punctuation that joins two sentences that are similar to each other, that really complement each other, right? But we're using the semicolon to blend them into one sentence, essentially. But it's actually still kind of two sentences, but we're blending them into one. So in here we have, I stayed up all night working, semicolon, the morning sun was beautiful, right? We can do it that way. That's absolutely perfectly great construction. That's a really great use of a semicolon. And semicolons are fun if you use them correctly. So that's one way to do it. The fourth way to do that, to fix that, is we can join the sentences using a coordinating conjunction. Remember, we talked about conjunctions, of course, a lot throughout what we've talked about. But we can join the sentences using a coordinating conjunction and really specifically, got to use that and a comma. Make sure you don't use the coordinating conjunction without the comma, or use the comma without the coordinating conjunction, right? Because we're trying to fix that fused sentence. So I stayed up all night working, comma, and the morning sun was beautiful. See how that works together? Now all of a sudden we're not fusing our sentences together. We have two different concepts that are blended in together, but because we like the way that they relate to each other, these are how we join them. And so now we fix that problem of fused sentences. As you go through this week and you look at some more fused sentences, and you practice, do some of those practice exercises, and really read about that and dig into that, hopefully this begins to really reveal itself and make a lot more sense. So let's move on to the next concept. Okay, so we've talked about fused sentences in terms of what run-on sentences are. Here's the second part. The second part is a comma splice. Now we've added the comma, but we've forgotten about the coordinating conjunction, right? So in a comma splice, there's incorrect punctuation between the two independent clauses, as in this example. Generally, this is comma, right? Because it's called a comma splice. So in this one, the show was over, comma, everyone went home. We have two independent clauses sitting next to each other. We've got a comma in between them separating them, but we forgot about adding that coordinating conjunction, right? So that's going to really kind of hurt what we're doing. Because they're independent, we need to correct this, but we go through the exact same process that we went through before. We have still the 4 different ways of fixing them, and they're the exact same 4 different ways of fixing the run-on sentence. So let's just kind of go through and fix this sentence as well. So we can use the comma, we can keep the comma where it's at, and then add a subordinating conjunction on the beginning of it, right? So now we can say, because the show was over, everyone went home. Right? People aren't going to stay because the show's over, obviously. But now, instead of this being a comma splice, we have the word because in front of it, makes it a complete sentence. It makes that beginning part of the sentence an independent clause. We're joining that with a dependent clause. We don't need to have the coordinating conjunction in there because we put the subordinating conjunction in the beginning. Hopefully those words are starting to, if they haven't already, make a lot of sense. So let's look at the second one, right? We have the same rule, the same way of getting over that we had with the fuse sentence. We're using the same thing for the comma splice, right? So in the same thing, we can separate them into 2 sentences. Take out the comma, put a period in there, capitalize the first word of the second part of the sentence, and now we have 2 separate sentences, right? We have the show was over, right? We have the show being our subject. What's the show doing? Well, it was over, right? So the show was is a complete sentence. The same part of the second one, everyone being our subject. What did everyone do? Everyone went. So we have our subject is everyone. We have our verb as went is a complete sentence. So now the show was over, period. Everyone went home. 2 complete sentences, problem solved, right? So let's go on. Let's talk about the third way we do this, the magical semicolon. This is the easy one, right? Pop out that comma because we don't need it anymore. Drop in a semicolon. If you're writing, just put a little period over your comma, and everything's great, right? Because now you're taking those 2 things that could be complete sentences, those 2 independent clauses, if you will, and we're blending them together, but we're doing them in a way that doesn't make our sentences run on, if you will. So the show was over, semicolon, everyone went home. Perfectly great construction. Everything's perfect. We've kept them separate in the way that we need to separate them, but we've kept them together because we want those 2 ideas to go together. It's a really great way. The other one is almost as easy, right? So we're joining the sentences using a coordinating conjunction and the comma. In our first thing, when we first did this comma splice sentence, we had the comma in there, but we needed to add the coordinating conjunction. So let's go back to the fanboys, right? So we have those coordinating conjunctions. Let's just drop a so in there because so is a really great one, right? The show was over. We've got the comma already in place, but we keep that comma there. Now we add the word so, right? Or we could add another one, right? The show was over, comma, so everyone went home. Or we could say the show was over, but everyone went home. Well, that doesn't really make a lot of sense, but it would be a grammatically correct sentence. The show was over, comma, and everyone went home. We can use any number of those coordinating conjunctions, and they're going to work. And so those are going to get us through. Okay, so we've basically looked at a fragmented sentence, right? A fragmented sentence is a sentence that is missing either the subject or it's missing the verb unless one or the other of those is implied, right? Which very rarely happens. So make sure that your sentence has someone or something doing something, right? That you need to have that for a complete sentence. If you have the subordinating conjunction in front of that, however, now you need to have another part. So if you have that subordinating conjunction, or if you're missing the verb or the subject, you have a fragmented sentence, and you need to go back and do something to correct that. Right? The other part is run-on sentences, of course, in 2 parts. We've got the fused sentence, so we've got the sentence without correct punctuation in between it, right? It doesn't have that punctuation, so basically, and we'll just use the thing we have up on the screen, right? If we just cut out the comma in the middle of it and just So if we just say, if we just say the show is over, everyone went home, and we don't have any punctuation in between that, right? Now we've got a fused sentence, so we need to put some sort of punctuation in between there, or in the run-on sentence. In the comma splice, we've got the comma in there, but we don't have the coordinating conjunction, right? So we're saying the show is over, comma, everyone went home, right? Those are going to be run-on sentences. To correct those, we simply go through one of our four things. We either use the comma that's already there, but put a subordinating conjunction before it, right? In the case of the run-on sentence, or in the case of the comma splice. In the case of the fused sentence, we would also want to add that comma in there. Or we separate the sentences with a period. Easy enough, right? We separate the sentences with a semicolon, easy enough. Or in the last one, we join the sentences using a coordinating conjunction and a comma. So in the case of the fused sentence, we need to add both of those, both the comma and the coordinating conjunction. In the case of the comma splice, we're simply adding that coordinating conjunction. Hopefully this is starting to make sense. Language and understanding grammar is a pretty tough thing, but once you get this down, you'll love it. Hopefully you won't be as scared of writing if you have fear toward writing, and people will notice how great a writer you are, and everything will be fantastic. So once again, if you have any questions or comments or concerns, if you have any of those, if you see ways that we can make these video series better, if you see things that maybe you're still confused about, or if you have questions on, hopefully you have lots of questions, but please go to your instructor. Let your instructor know. If if it's something to do with the way we put these videos together, your instructor will inform us, and we'll be able to get those things corrected. If it has something to do with just understanding the concept or whatever, your instructor will be more than happy to work with you to solve that problem or to help you understand it a little better. So have a great week. Have a very successful week. This is week 4, so this is kind of the midpoint in the class. You've gotten this far, so by the time you finish this week, you're halfway through this class. Hopefully these concepts are starting to resonate. They're starting to become part of the way that you think about language, and hopefully you have a fantastic week, and then we'll see you again next week. Thanks.